Almost 2,000 years ago, a man helped transform Judaism forever. His name, Rabbi Akiva, teacher, visionary, martyr, and the protagonist of stories that still raise uncomfortable questions. Who was he really? What do the sources say? In this documentary, we will reveal an uncomfortable truth about the man considered the father of Rabbinic Judaism.
Shalom. Shalom. Welcome back, as we do every week, to your channel, La Mishnah TV. Today, we will study the asterisk parasha Ekev, but from a different perspective, by analyzing and tracing the footsteps of a historical figure. What if I told you that the name Rabbi Akiva might conceal a connection to one of the most unsettling images in the entire Torah? A serpent, a heel, Jacob clinging to Esau, and many centuries later, one of the most extraordinary and tragic sages in Jewish history. It seems too perfect, perhaps dangerously perfect, because this is where our problem begins. The name Akiva is often linguistically linked to asterisk Yaakov, Jacob, and to the Hebrew root asterisk Ekev. But asterisk EKEV is an extraordinarily provocative word. It can lead us to the semantic realm of the heel, or to that which comes as a consequence. It even appears with the meaning of because, or on account of. And then, something fascinating happens. We open Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 12, and find, "And it shall come to pass, as a consequence of your listening." This is precisely the beginning of the asterisk parasha Ekev. But let us travel much further back now. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. The primordial serpent receives a chilling sentence. There will be enmity between it and humanity. The human being will strike its head, while it will strike the human's heel. And what word appears again? Ekev, heel. And there is still one piece missing. Genesis chapter 25, verse 26. Jacob is born. And what is the future patriarch of Israel doing as he enters the world? His hand is grasping Esau's heel. That is why he receives the name Yaakov. Now consider the temptation. Akiva, Yaakov, Ekev, Esau's heel, the heel threatened by the serpent, consequence, history, redemption. Suddenly, it seems as though Rabbi Akiva's very life were encoded within his name. There is just one small hitch. We have no record of Rabbi Akiva interpreting his own life in this way. Nor do we know of any Tannaitic source that constructs this entire chain of connections. This is precisely where a serious class differs from one that is merely spectacular, for a beautiful connection does not automatically become a historical one. But then, something even more interesting happens. More than 1,000 years after Rabbi Akiva, the Kabbalah of Safed revisits these ancient words. In asterisk Shar HaGilgalim, a work conveying the teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari, recorded by Rabbi Chaim Vital in the 16th century, we find a surprising interpretation. Akiva and Akavia appear linked to the so-called heel of the heel, and Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, enters into a mystical construct involving both Jacob and Akiva. At that point, the question shifts entirely. We must no longer ask merely, does the name Akiva mean heel? The truly explosive question is this. Are we uncovering the historical significance of Rabbi Akiva, or are we observing how Kabbalah, centuries later, transformed his figure into part of a spiritual map of human history? For etymology is not the same as interpretation. The Bible is not the same as biography. And above all, an ancient source is not the same as a later Kabbalistic reading. But a word of caution. To say an interpretation is late is not to say it lacks depth. It means we must learn to listen to it correctly. In this class, we will disentangle three worlds that are too often conflated: linguistics, history, and mysticism. And when we finally look again at Jacob's heel, the serpent's strike, and the name of Rabbi Akiva, we will discover something far more interesting than a mere coincidence. We will discover how the spiritual memory of Judaism functions. For some, ideas are born alongside a figure, and others are born centuries later, when a tradition turns its gaze back to that figure and discovers in him something that previous generations had not yet articulated. Before recounting the life of Rabbi Akiva, we must confront an uncomfortable question. How much of what we think we know about Akiva actually happened, and how much was constructed by later generations? For Akiva left no autobiography. We have no book authored by him, nor do we possess an inscription, a letter, or a contemporary Roman account that states unequivocally, this was Rabbi Akiva, and this is what happened to him. And here, the researcher's true work begins. Our oldest extensive rabbinic source is the Mishnah, compiled by Rabbi Judah the Prince and his circle around the year 200. It therefore holds relative priority. But a word of caution, the Mishnah is not a recording from the 2nd century either. It is an edited work. Then we have the Tosefta and the halachic midrashim, Mekilta, Sifra, and Sifrei. They preserve materials that may date back to the Tannaitic period, though their composition is stratified. Later comes the Jerusalem Talmud, formed primarily in late Roman Palestine during the 4th and 5th centuries, and later still the Babylonian Talmud, whose literary form belongs fundamentally to the 5th and 6th centuries, even though it preserves numerous earlier traditions. Finally, we encounter narrative midrashim and mystical texts, some of them quite late, in which Akiva no longer appears merely as a teacher of halacha. He becomes a hero, a martyr, a visionary, and a guarantor of the Torah. Does this mean we should distrust everything? No. It means something far more interesting. We must learn to make distinctions. For every story about Akiva, we will ask 3 questions. What might have happened historically? What did the narrator intend to teach us? And what function does Akiva serve within Jewish collective memory? This distinction is fundamental. Zvi Novik, for instance, in his review of Reuven Hammer's *Akiva, Life, Legend, Legacy, points to a methodologically fascinating case. A Talmudic narrative presents a legal inquiry addressed to Akiva while he was in prison. However, it is possible that this scene is a later expansion, created by combining a ruling preserved in the Mishnah with the tradition that Akiva ended up imprisoned. A story can convey memory and meaning without functioning like a Roman Empire security camera. That is why, during this class, we will use 4 degrees of certainty. We will consider it relatively certain that Akiva was a prominent Palestinian Tana of the late 1st and early 2nd centuries. He participated in legal debates, ran an influential school, was associated with Roman persecution or imprisonment, and came to occupy a central place in rabbinic memory. We will consider it probable, though a matter of reconstruction, that he lived roughly between the years 50 and 135, that he taught in Lod and Bnei Barak, studied with figures linked to the Yavne generation, and played a decisive role in organizing legal materials. Then we enter different territory. His poverty, his alleged background as a convert, his late start in his studies, his wife Rachel, the 12 years followed by another 12 years of absence, and the famous 24,000 disciples belong to ancient traditions that we cannot verify historically with certainty. And finally, we encounter clearly literary or mystical developments. Moses entering Akiva's classroom, Akiva entering and emerging unscathed from Pardes, and later the genealogies of souls, reincarnations, and the mysterious heel of the heel. This methodology will be our compass. We are not going to destroy tradition in the name of history, nor sacrifice history to protect a traditional reading. We are going to do something more difficult, and precisely for that reason, more Jewish. Learn to formulate better questions. Because when we distinguish between history, tradition, literature, and mysticism, Akiva does not become less fascinating. He becomes far more fascinating. To understand Rabbi Akiva, We must first imagine a Judaism that had just lost what seemed impossible to lose, the temple in Jerusalem. According to conventional chronology, Akiva was born around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, in the year 70. His generation did not inherit stability. It inherited a crisis. For centuries, sacrifice had held a central place in religious and national life. Suddenly, it was no longer practicable. Then an extraordinary question arose. How does a civilization continue when one of the fundamental centers around which it organized its relationship with God disappears? The answer did not come immediately. Authority, the calendar, prayer, laws of purity, study, and jurisdiction all had to be reorganized. And all this took place under Roman rule, amidst messianic tensions that eventually culminated in the Bar Kokhba revolt between the years 132 and 135 or 136. But we must avoid a very common oversimplification. Rabbinic Judaism did not magically appear at Yavne the day after the temple's destruction. Scholars such as Shia J.D. Cohen, Seth Schwartz, and Chaim Lapin have shown that the consolidation of rabbinic authority was gradual and uneven across different regions and social strata. Second-century rabbis did not automatically control the entire Jewish population. Therefore, when we speak of Yavne, we should not imagine a council that met, voted, and founded a sort of rabbinic church. History tends to be far messier than our textbooks suggest. Yavne was a center of intellectual reconstruction, and subsequently a powerful symbol of authority. It is precisely within this world that Akiva assumes extraordinary stature. For Akiva represents an answer to the problem of continuity. If the temple could no longer function as before, holiness had to continue to inhabit time, conduct, and the community. Where? In study, in observance, in interpretation, in legal memory. This does not mean that Akiva removed the temple from the theological horizon. Quite the opposite. A significant portion of the Mishnah preserves, with extraordinary precision, the sacrifices, offerings, and purity laws associated with a sanctuary that was no longer functioning. And here arises one of the great paradoxes of Rabbinic Judaism. The temple was physically destroyed, yet it survived in text. Akiva and the rabbinic movement helped transform a tradition deeply rooted in places, institutions, and practices into a religious architecture capable of travel, a portable architecture. Rome could destroy buildings, it could control territories, but it was far more difficult to destroy a civilization that had learned to carry its holiness through words, practices, interpretation, and memory. And perhaps therein lies the true secret of Jewish survival. When we think of Rabbi Akiva, we tend to picture the great master fully formed, brilliant, revered, and surrounded by disciples. Yet rabbinic tradition insists on showing us something far more provocative. Before the giant emerged, there existed a man lacking intellectual prestige, poor and far removed from the world of the sages. The sources refer to him simply as Akiva, or Akiva ben Yosef. Even his name calls for caution. We find spelling variations, some ending with the letter Aleph and others with He, linked to Aramaic and Palestinian orthographic conventions. While automatically interpreting every spelling difference as a mystical secret might be exciting, we must first demonstrate that the source actually intended such a meaning. And what of his family? Later traditions portray Akiva as a descendant of converts. More elaborate accounts even link his lineage to Sisera, the notorious enemy of Israel mentioned in the Book of Judges. Historically, we cannot verify this ancestry. Literarily, however, it conveys a powerful message. Greatness in Torah study is not the exclusive province of a blood aristocracy. This brings us to one of the most beautiful stories about Akiva. Avot de Rabbi Natan, version A, chapter 6, depicts him at the age of 40, standing before a stone worn through by water. Akiva observes something seemingly insignificant, drop after drop, water against stone. He realizes that if something so soft can penetrate something so hard, the Torah, too, can penetrate his heart. It is an extraordinary scene. Yet here we must once again consult our historical compass. The number 40 carries immense biblical significance. 40 days, 40 years, periods of trial, transition, and transformation. Therefore, to claim that Akiva began his studies on the exact day of his 40th birthday would be to assert more than our sources allow us to prove. Moreover, the Babylonian Talmud preserves an even more unsettling image. Pesachim 49b attributes a surprising confession to Akiva. When he was an ignoramus, he felt such hostility toward Torah scholars that he wished to bite them like a donkey. Not exactly the resume one would expect for the future giant of Rabbinic Judaism. Nedarim 50a and Ketubot 62b, 63a subsequently elaborate on the famous traditions regarding his poverty, his marriage, and the long years dedicated to his education. There, we see the Akiva who leaves behind a humble life, studies for 12-year periods, and returns as a teacher to thousands. But here, too, we must look at the numbers. 12 years, another 12, 12,000 or 24,000 students, depending on the tradition and context. These figures may preserve historical memory, but they also possess a clear literary structure. Researcher Azan Yadin Israel has argued that the image of the unlearned youth who transforms into an inspired interpreter of the Torah was particularly amplified by later sources. Does this mean the entire story was fabricated? Not necessarily, and therein lies the methodological key. We need not choose between two extremes. It all happened exactly this way, or it is all fiction. It is entirely possible that these traditions preserve a genuine memory of social mobility, poverty, or a relatively late start to his education, and that later generations transformed that memory into a powerful pedagogical biography. For perhaps the most important question is not whether a specific drop actually fell upon that stone. The question is why generations of Jews needed to remember Akiva contemplating it. And the answer is profoundly human. Because his story proclaims that a person's past does not have absolute claim over their future. The stone may be hard, the heart may feel closed off. The years may have slipped by, but according to the memory of Akiva, as long as a single drop of learning continues to fall, transformation remains possible. Behind the extraordinary transformation of Rabbi Akiva stands a woman. And here an uncomfortable question arises. Do we truly know her name, or did tradition eventually assign her a more precise identity than our earliest sources allow? In some early versions, Akiva's wife remains unnamed. Tradition presents her as the daughter of Kolba Savua, and later identifies her as Rachel. This distinction matters, for when we study rabbinic literature, we must observe not only what a story says, but how that story evolves over the centuries. And there is a phrase attributed to Akiva that became the emotional heart of the narrative. What is mine and what is yours belongs to her. In other words, my Torah and your Torah exist thanks to her. This phrase radically transforms the image of the great teacher. Akiva ceases to be the solitary genius who conquered knowledge through individual effort. His learning becomes a family enterprise. While he studied, someone else paid the economic, emotional, and domestic price of that decision. And here, a critical reading must ask a question that romanticized interpretations often avoid. Who bore the cost of those years of absence? The story certainly honors the wife, yet it does so within a predominantly male literary universe, bound to the ideal of rabbinic study, where prolonged marital separation can be viewed as a legitimate sacrifice for the sake of the Torah. We can admire such spiritual devotion while still acknowledging the ethical tension involved. That is precisely what it means to study a tradition with maturity, allowing the text to inspire us while simultaneously letting it unsettle us. Of course, no sage is formed entirely in isolation. Rabbinic networks link Akiva to some of the most important figures of his generation: Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah, Nahum Ishgamzu, Rabban Gamaliel II, and Rabbi Tarfon. Various traditions place his activities in Lod and Bnei Brak, and here appears a scene that millions of Jews recall every year. The Passover Haggadah envisions Akiva in Bnei Brak alongside Eliezer, Yehoshua, Eliezer ben Azariah, and Tarfon, discussing the exodus from Egypt throughout the night, until their disciples arrive to announce that the time for the morning Shema has come. Historically, we must be cautious. The Haggadah reached its definitive form much later. But from a literary standpoint, the scene conveys something extraordinary. Akiva already belongs to the highest echelon of interpreters. Yet we should not picture him as a sort of pope of Rabbinic Judaism. Akiva engaged in debate, and he did so frequently. He debated Rabbi Ishmael on hermeneutics, Tarfon on legal matters, and Eliezer and Yehoshua on various aspects of religious practice. Even his messianic interpretation met with opposition. According to a tradition in the Jerusalem Talmud, when Akiva interpreted Bar Kosiba in messianic terms, another sage retorted with a devastating remark: "Akiva, grass will grow on your cheeks before the son of David arrives." This reveals something essential about the rabbinic world. Its greatness did not lie in everyone thinking alike. It lay precisely in having built a culture capable of sustaining disagreement. A master could be extraordinary and yet be wrong. A colleague could contradict him without undermining his authority. Debate was not necessarily a threat to tradition. Often, it was the very mechanism by which tradition remained alive. And perhaps that is one of the most modern teachings of Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues. An intellectually healthy community does not need to silence dissenting voices to protect the truth. It needs to learn how to debate them. For when a tradition stops asking questions, it may hold on to its answers for a time. But when it also preserves its disagreements, it preserves something even more important: the capacity to keep thinking. There is a moment in the story of Rabbi Akiva when everything seems to come to an end. Thousands of disciples vanish, his intellectual world lies in ruins, Rome intensifies its repression. And yet, it is precisely from that catastrophe that the generation emerges which will help transmit rabbinic Torah to the future. The Babylonian Talmud, Yevamot 62b, recounts that Akiva had 12,000 pairs of disciples, that is 24,000 students, and that they died between Passover and Shavuot. The reason? The text states that they did not treat one another with respect. The consequence is described by a terrible word: the world was left desolate of Torah. This tradition lies behind some of the mourning customs observed during the period of the Omer. But here, a very popular interpretation arises that we must examine carefully. It is frequently claimed that those 24,000 disciples were actually soldiers of Bar Kosiba, and that they died during the rebellion against Rome. Is it possible that there is some historical basis linked to the upheavals of that era? That is open to debate. Does Yevamot 62b state this explicitly? No. Directly identifying the disciples as an army belongs to modern, or at least later, interpretations. It cannot simply be presented as a statement made by the Babylonian Talmud. Furthermore, there are variants of the asterisk epistle of Sharira Gaon that speak of persecution. While these are important for studying the evolution of the tradition, they do not allow us to automatically transform the 24,000 students into soldiers. The historical minimum we can glean is more cautious, and, curiously, no less impressive. Rabbinic memory preserves the recollection of a catastrophic rupture in the chain of transmission. And then, Akiva begins anew. He teaches 5 sages from the south: Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Shammua. 5 names, yet those 5 names would prove fundamental to later Tannaitic literature. The tradition conveys something extraordinary. The system was on the verge of collapse, yet the transmission was successfully rebuilt. And so we arrive at the end of Akiva's life. The Tosefta, Sanhedrin 2-8, already contains a Tannaitic attestation of his imprisonment. Thus, the association of Akiva with imprisonment does not rely solely on late medieval legends. However, the classic scene of his martyrdom is unforgettably depicted in Berachot 61b. Rome forbids the teaching of Torah. Akiva continues to teach. He is arrested. His flesh is torn away with iron combs. And while he is being tortured, the moment arrives to recite the Shema. Then Akiva declares, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your soul." His disciples are bewildered. Even now? Akiva explains that throughout his life, he had interpreted "with all your soul" to mean even if he takes your soul. He had always wondered when he would have the opportunity to fulfill those words. Finally, he prolongs the word, one, and he dies. Here, interpretation and body converge. The verse ceases to be merely something Akiva explains. According to the narrative, it becomes something Akiva embodies to the ultimate consequence. Historically, it is plausible that he was executed amidst Roman repression. Yet the iron combs, the dialogue, the precise moment of the Shema, and the dramatic structure must also be studied as a form of martyrological memory. The same applies to the so-called 10 martyrs. That tradition gathers figures from different eras. We should not read it as if 10 rabbis were executed together on a single day under Roman rule. And perhaps here we find the true legacy of this phase of Akiva's life. First, he loses disciples. Then, he rebuilds the circle of disciples. Finally, he loses his life. But the transmission continues. That is the message that rabbinic memory constructed around his figure. Rome could imprison the master and destroy his body. What it could not imprison was the chain of teaching Akiva had left behind. Rabbi Akiva did not write a book that we can place on a table and say, "This is Akiva's work." And yet his influence is everywhere. For perhaps his great work was not a book, it was a system. The Babylonian Talmud, Gittin 67a, uses an extraordinary expression to describe him, Otsar Balum. We can understand this roughly as a full repository, an organized or even compartmentalized storehouse. But Avot de Rabbi Natan, chapter 18, offers an even clearer image. It compares Akiva to a laborer who goes out into the fields and gathers wheat, barley, spelt, beans, and lentils. At first, everything arrives jumbled together, but upon returning home, he begins to sort them out. Wheat with wheat, barley with barley, lentils with lentils. It seems like a fairly simple agricultural scene. In reality, it describes an intellectual revolution. For generations, the legal tradition had circulated through orally transmitted teachings, rulings, disputes, interpretations, and formulas. The challenge was not merely preserving information. It had to be organized, interconnected, classified, made transmissible. And therein lies the significance of Akiva. When we encounter the phrase Mishnah of Akiva, we should not necessarily imagine that Akiva sat down, wrote a codex, and produced an early version identical to the Mishnah we have today. It could refer to something far more dynamic, an organized oral repertoire, formulations designed for memorization, collections of legal rulings, thematic classifications, and above all, networks of disciples tasked with transmitting and reorganizing that knowledge. This is fundamental to understanding rabbinic culture. Orality does not simply mean that a person hears a phrase and repeats it exactly, like a human tape recorder. As Elizabeth Shanks Alexander has noted, oral transmission also entails selecting, arranging, comparing, adapting, and reconstructing. Rabbinic memory was an intellectual technology. And Akiva appears to have been one of its great architects. For this reason, his influence may be far greater than the number of sayings we can historically attribute to him with absolute certainty. A teacher may leave behind a book, but he may also leave something perhaps more powerful, a way of organizing knowledge. And this helps explain why Akiva is pivotal to understanding the path that leads to the Mishnah. Not because we can claim he wrote our Mishnah, but because tradition remembers him doing something indispensable for the existence of a Mishnah, taking a universe of scattered teachings and transforming it into a transmissible architecture. Akiva did not merely teach Torah, he helped teach how to organize the Torah so that the next generation could continue teaching it. If we were to map out the intellectual family tree of Rabbinic Judaism, one line would appear again and again: Akiva, Meir, Yehuda HaNasi. But take note, for this gives rise to a fascinating and potentially dangerous assertion that virtually the entire rabbinic tradition passed through the filter of Rabbi Akiva. Is it true? Yes, provided we understand the metaphor correctly. The Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 86a, preserves a fundamental statement attributed to Rabbi Yochanan. An anonymous Mishnah corresponds to Rabbi Meir, an anonymous Tosefta to Rabbi Nehemiah, an anonymous Sifra to Rabbi Yehuda, an anonymous Sifrei to Rabbi Shimon, and then comes the decisive phrase, and all of them follow Rabbi Akiva. This seems to place Akiva behind some of the great collections of Tannaitic literature, yet we must interpret the text correctly. Sanhedrin 86a is not presenting modern statistics regarding authorship. It is an Amoraic editorial genealogy, a retrospective explanation of how the rabbis understood the transmission of those collections. Nevertheless, it reveals something extraordinarily important. The disciples linked to Akiva were perceived as major conduits of transmission, and this is where Rabbi Meir enters the picture. Meir was a central figure in the formation of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the sage associated with the compilation of the Mishnah around the year 200. We can thus envision a vast intellectual funnel. First, there are traditions predating and contemporary to Akiva. Akiva receives, interprets, classifies, and reorganizes them using his own methodology. Next, materials linked to his school are carried forward by figures such as Meir, Yehuda, Shimon, and Nehemiah. Finally, the great Tannaitic compilations emerge: the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Halakhic Midrashim. And centuries later, the Talmuds discuss, reinterpret, and expand upon those materials. We can now understand why it might be said, with some caution, that Akiva was the great filter. His school occupies a central genealogical position. His disciples appear among the most important voices of the Mishnah. His hermeneutics profoundly transformed the relationship between the biblical text and halakha. The Talmud even depicts him as an interpreter capable of deriving mountains of laws from the minutest details of the letters themselves. Yet here we must insert a major historical caveat. Not everything originates with Akiva. The Mishnah preserves traditions linked to the temple, the houses of Hillel and Shammai, priestly circles, Yavne, and other lines of transmission. Furthermore, the school of Rabbi Ishmael developed a distinct hermeneutic methodology. And one fundamental figure is still missing: Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. For Yehuda Hanassi was no mere secretary who received a folder labeled Akiva's Tradition and simply published it. He selected materials, he juxtaposed them, he organized them, he reformulated them. He and his circle represent the Mishnah's final great editorial filter. Nor did the process end there. For centuries, the Amoraim and the redactors of the Talmuds reinterpreted those teachings, building new layers upon the old. That is why Sanhedrin 86a should be read as a powerful rabbinic theory regarding the genealogy of tradition, rather than as proof that every anonymous text historically originated with Akiva. The most rigorous formulation would be this: Akiva was likely the most influential filter for one of the currents that came to occupy the center of Rabbinic Judaism, but he was not the exclusive source of the entire tradition, nor was he its final editor, and therein lies his true greatness. Akiva did not need to author everything in order to change everything. For some teachers, write books, others shape disciples, but the truly exceptional create a way of thinking that continues to work centuries after they have disappeared. Here we arrive at one of the most revolutionary ideas associated with Rabbi Akiva: how much meaning can be hidden within a single word of the Torah. To us, a repetition might seem like nothing more than a repetition. In the traditional view of Akiva, however, it can become a gateway to a new legal implication. The classic contrast pits two major hermeneutic models against each other. On one hand, there is the school of Rabbi Ishmael, associated with the principle the Torah speaks in human language. In other words, not every repetition, particle, or seemingly redundant construction necessarily yields a new law. Logical and contextual approaches predominate. On the other hand, Akiva's school represents a different sensibility. If the text is divinely revealed, its specific details possess extraordinary density. An extra word might include a specific case. Another expression might exclude it. Hence, procedures such as *ribui umiut, inclusion and limitation. The difference may seem minor, yet the consequences are immense, for we are discussing how Scripture is transformed into law. However, we must be careful not to turn Ishmael and Akiva into two computers programmed with opposing algorithms. Midrashic texts are layered, and the categories associated with these schools were often organized retrospectively. Azan Yadin Israel, for instance, has challenged the practice of simply labeling the entire Sifra as Akivan. He proposes distinguishing between different layers, and even speaks of a hermeneutics of camouflage, wherein extra-biblical traditions are presented literarily, as if they emerged directly from Scripture. And so we arrive at one of the most audacious scenes in the entire Talmud, Menachot 29b. Moses watches God placing small crowns upon the letters of the Torah. He asks, why are they necessary? God replies that generations later, a man named Akiva ben Yosef will appear, a man capable of deriving mountains of halakot, laws, from those very strokes. Moses is then transported to Akiva's classroom, and the unthinkable happens. Moses does not understand the lesson. The man who received the Torah at Sinai does not comprehend the rabbinic interpretation of the Torah, until he hears the students ask, "Rabbi, how do you know this?" And Akiva replies, "It is a law given to Moses at Sinai." The irony is extraordinary. Moses does not intellectually recognize that which bears his own name. But therein lies the profundity of the story. Menachot 29b does not demonstrate that the historical Akiva was literally deriving laws from graphic flourishes. It is a reflection on continuity and novelty. Rabbinic Torah can take forms that Moses historically never knew, yet still be understood, theologically, as a continuation of Sinai. According to Yadin Israel, this image also belongs to a literary transformation of Akiva, especially visible in the Babylonian tradition. The master of ancient sources ends up becoming an almost oracular interpreter. And this leads us to the truly important question. When the rabbis linked a halacha to a verse, what was happening? Sometimes, perhaps, the practice existed first, and the verse served as support. In other cases, the interpretation could yield a new consequence. In others, text and tradition corrected one another, and a later redaction might present something previously received as tradition as a biblical deduction. Should we call that fraud? Historically, no. To demonstrate deception, we would need to prove knowledge of a falsehood, an intention to conceal it, and a deliberate will to mislead others. We possess no evidence allowing us to attribute those elements to Akiva. The interesting academic question goes much deeper. It is not simply, did Akiva invent laws? It is this. How does a community that changes over the course of history manage to maintain the conviction that it continues to hear the same revelation? And perhaps therein lies the secret of his hermeneutics. For Akiva, according to rabbinic memory, interpreting did not mean breaking away from Sinai. It meant discovering how much future could still be contained within a word spoken in the past. If someone were to tell you that Rabbi Akiva's thought could be summarized in a single word, they would likely say love. But that would be insufficient. For the Akiva found in rabbinic sources speaks simultaneously of human dignity, the chosenness of Israel, freedom, responsibility, repentance, and hope in the face of destruction. Mishnah Avot 3:14 attributes an extraordinary triad to him. Beloved is the human being, for he was created in the divine image. Then he adds, Beloved is Israel, for they were called children of God. And finally, Beloved is Israel, they received a precious instrument, the Torah. Observe the architecture. First, humanity, then covenant, finally, revelation. Akiva does not limit the divine image exclusively to Israel. He speaks of Adam, the human being. Yet neither does he eliminate the particularity of Israel. They are concentric circles of value, universal human dignity, covenantal identity, and the responsibility of the Torah. And then another paradox emerges. Avot 3:15 declares, "Everything is foreseen, yet freedom is granted. God knows, the human being chooses." A contradiction? Akiva does not attempt to resolve it through a simple philosophical formula. He transforms it into an ethical responsibility. Even though God knows, you remain responsible for your decisions. And so we arrive at his most famous teaching. Sifra Kedoshim 4:12 attributes to Akiva the interpretation of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Akiva asserts it is a great principle of the Torah. But Ben Azai responds with something even more universal. This is the book of the generations of Adam, Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. Why might he consider it superior? Because the dignity of the other should not depend solely on their being my neighbor, nor on whether they love me, think as I do, or belong to my community. We all descend from Adam. And here, a painful irony appears. Yevamot 62b states that Akiva's disciples died because they did not treat one another with respect. The school of the teacher who proclaimed love as a fundamental principle fails precisely in the relationships among its own students. It is a contradiction turned into pedagogy. One can know the principle perfectly, yet fail completely to put it into practice. Akiva also passionately defended the sanctity of the Song of Songs. Mishnah Yadayim 3-5 attributes an extraordinary statement to him. All the writings are holy, but the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. This does not mean that Akiva personally closed the canon. It means he could contemplate deeply erotic poetry and discover within it a sublime language to express covenant, love, and divine presence. And when he speaks of repentance, he once again transforms a ritual image. Mishnah Yoma 8-9 concludes, "Happy are you, Israel. Your Father in heaven purifies you." God appears metaphorically as a mikveh. After the destruction of the temple, purification is not confined to the ruins of a building. Teshuvah transforms the relationship with God into a kind of moral sanctuary. And perhaps no story encapsulates Akiva better than Makot 24b. The sages gaze upon the ruins of the temple. They see a fox emerging from the site of the Holy of Holies. They weep. Akiva laughs, not because the destruction leaves him indifferent. Precisely because it causes him pain, he interprets it. If the prophecies of destruction came to pass, Akiva reasons, then the prophecies of restoration must also come to pass. The scene is likely a literary construct, but its theological message is extraordinary. Akiva does not deny the ruins. He looks at them directly, and he discovers that a ruin does not necessarily mean the covenant has ended. It can mean that history is not yet over. Perhaps that is one of his most profound teachings. Jewish hope does not consist in pretending that the fox is not walking among the ruined stones. It consists in seeing it, acknowledging the catastrophe, and refusing to believe that the ruins have the final word. There is a scene in rabbinic literature that transformed Rabbi Akiva into something more than a jurist. It turned him into a man capable of entering the realm of mystery and returning. Tosefta Hagigah 2-3, and subsequently the Babylonian Talmud, Hagigah 14b, preserve the famous tradition of the four who entered the *Pardes. But what does Pardes mean? Literally, the word means garden or orchard. However, within the narrative, it serves as an image representing access to an extraordinarily dangerous esoteric experience or knowledge. Four enter. Ben Azai gazes upon the mystery and dies. Ben Zoma is left damaged. Elisha ben Avuya, later known as *aher, the other, cuts the shoots, an enigmatic expression associated with a radical spiritual rupture. And finally, Akiva enters, the only one who enters and leaves, *Beishalom, in peace. The image is powerful because it conveys a warning. In the rabbinic tradition, approaching the mystery does not automatically mean attaining wisdom. One can also become lost. Unbounded spiritual knowledge can destroy that which it sought to illuminate. Akiva, by contrast, emerges as the model of the disciplined mystic, someone capable of approaching the abyss without allowing that abyss to destroy his relationship with the Torah. Yet here, we must once again distinguish between history and memory. Centuries later, texts linked to *Hekalot* literature, the celestial palaces, appear, featuring great rabbinic sages as protagonists in extraordinary ascents and revelations. We also find pseudo-epigraphic works such as *Otiot de Rabbi Akiva, the alphabet of Rabbi Akiva, in which the Hebrew letters take on cosmological and mystical dimensions. Does this mean that Rabbi Akiva personally wrote those works? No. Attributing an ancient text to a prestigious figure does not prove historical authorship. Rabbi Akiva came to function as a mark of authority as well. This is a well-known phenomenon in ancient religious literature. Texts were frequently attributed to figures such as Enoch, Moses, or Elijah in order to situate new revelations within a sacred lineage. We must therefore distinguish between two levels. First, there may well be a relatively early tradition linking Akiva to esoteric knowledge. But there is something we can state with greater certainty. Later generations viewed Akiva as the ideal figure to serve as the guardian of the mystery. And why him? Because few figures could unite elements that appeared so disparate. The letters, halacha, interpretation, Sinai, and finally, the celestial ascent. The very same Akiva, who, according to rabbinic tradition, could discern extraordinary meaning in the details of Scripture, could naturally become the master who uncovered secrets within the letters themselves. And perhaps therein lies the key. The historical Akiva belongs to the world of the sages. The literary Akiva enters the * Pardes, and the mystical Akiva travels even further still. For when a tradition transforms a master into a symbol, his biography ends where his legend begins. There is such a perfect connection between the name of Rabbi Akiva, Jacob's heel, and the serpent of Genesis that it is tempting to think it was there from the very beginning. The problem is, it wasn't there from the beginning, and that is precisely what makes it fascinating. The root *Ekev* runs through several foundational texts. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, the serpent attacks the heel of human offspring, while the human strikes its head. In Genesis chapter 25, verse 26, Jacob is born grasping Esau's heel. The narrative links this image to his name, Yaakov. Later, in Genesis chapter 27, verse 36, Esau again plays on Jacob's name and the idea of supplanting. And in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 12, we find, "And it shall be because," or as a consequence of your listening. From this, the * parashah, Torah portion, *Ekev*, takes its name. The word has traveled an extraordinary path. We move from the physical heel to that which comes behind, what follows, the consequence, and the reward. The heel is the low, vulnerable part of the body, but also that which completes our movement. Then Akiva appears. Akiva is generally considered an Aramaic or rabbinic form, linguistically related to Yaakov and * Ekev. The final aleph fits perfectly within Aramaic patterns. But we must be rigorous. This allows us to speak of a probable linguistic kinship and a traditional association, not of an absolutely proven etymology. And, above all, no known Tannaitic source states that Akiva was named after the * parashah, Ekev, that he was the heel that defeats the serpent, or that he consciously embodied Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. That construction would come later, much later. In the Middle Ages, Rashi comments on Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 12 by saying that we must heed even those minor mitzvot, commandments, that a person tends to trample with their heels. And here we can build an extraordinary bridge, provided we acknowledge that we are the ones building it. Asterisk, Ekev, asterisk, represents the small thing we tread upon. Akiva represents a hermeneutic tradition in which no detail of the Torah seems insignificant. What others trample upon may conceal mountains of asterisk halakot, asterisk. But the serpent is still missing. In the plain sense of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we find the enmity between human beings and serpents, head against heel. Later, Jewish and Christian traditions would develop moral, eschatological, and messianic readings. Symbolically, the image is compelling. The head represents the high, the realm of dominion. The heel represents the low, the vulnerable, and that which is close to the dust. And it is precisely from below that the struggle begins. Now, let us leap forward approximately 14 centuries, the 16th century. The Kabbalah of Isaac Luria, the Ari. In asterisk Shar Hagil Gulam, asterisk, Gate of Reincarnations, recorded by Chaim Vital, specifically in Introduction 31, we finally find an explicit connection. Akiva and Akavia ben Mahalalel are linked to the heel within a spiritual configuration of souls, and Akiva appears specifically associated with the heel of the heel. Thus, the text connects Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, the confrontation between serpent and heel, with Genesis chapter 25, verse 26, where Jacob grasps Esau's heel, and projects that spiritual dynamic onto Rabbi Akiva. Within this theology, descending to the periphery does not signify failure. It means reaching the very place that requires rectification. And so we can formulate a powerful reading. Symbolically, Akiva is the sage of the heel. He begins from below. He gathers up what is scorned. He listens to what others trample upon. He finds meaning where others see insignificant details. And through Torah, classification, and memory, he combats what the serpent can symbolically represent: chaos, rupture, and oblivion. It is an extraordinary interpretation, but it does not historically belong to the Akiva of the 2nd century. It belongs to the history of how later generations understood Akiva, and that distinction does not weaken the interpretation. It makes it intellectually honest. The historical Akiva organized traditions. The Talmudic Akiva discovered worlds within the letters, and the Kabbalistic Akiva descended to the heel of the heel to elevate that which remained below. Perhaps that is why this image remains so powerful, because sometimes repair does not begin in the head. It begins precisely where no one wants to look, at the heel. There is a long-standing accusation that has dogged Rabbi Akiva to this day, that the great Torah scholar supported a false messiah, contributed to a disastrous rebellion against Rome, and ultimately helped lead Judea to catastrophe. But what do we actually know? Between the years 132 and 135 or 136, Shimon bar Kosiba led a formidable rebellion against Rome. His coins and documents identify him as Nasi Yisrael, Prince of Israel. We are not talking merely about a band of guerrilla fighters. There was a rebel administration, military discipline, territorial control, and a strong religious identity. Cassius Dio, in Roman History 69.12-14, later describes a devastating war, and letters found in the Judean desert allow us to hear directly from Bar Kosiba's administration. But there is a crucial detail. Those letters do not mention Rabbi Akiva. So where does the famous connection between the two come from? From the Jerusalem Talmud, Ta'anit asterisk 4-5. There, Akiva interprets Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. A star shall come forth from Jacob. And he declares regarding Bar Kosiba, this is the King Messiah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta then responds with a devastating remark. Akiva, grass will grow on your cheeks, and the son of David will still not have come. The tradition is crystal clear. The historical question is whether it preserves anything Akiva actually said, for the Jerusalem Talmud took shape centuries after the rebellion. Scholars have proposed various possibilities. One holds that there is a historical core. Precisely because portraying the revered Akiva as a supporter of a defeated Messiah is uncomfortable, it is unlikely to have been invented. Peter Schaeffer, on the other hand, has argued, through an analysis of textual variants and literary layers, that Akiva may have been introduced into the story during its later development. Matthew V. Novenson proposes reading the scene also as a literary topos of late antiquity, the religious sage who recognizes the ruler destined to transform the world. In other words, the tradition cannot simply be erased, but neither can it be treated as a recording from the year 132. And did Akiva fight? Centuries later, Maimonides, in *Mishnah Torah, Laws of Kings 11, calls him Bar Kosiba's *Nosei Kelov, an expression that can be interpreted as bearer of his weapons, armor bearer, or partisan. But Maimonides was writing in the Middle Ages. We possess no contemporary evidence demonstrating that Akiva masterminded the rebellion, commanded troops, directed the government, controlled Bar Kosiba, or forced the Jewish population to participate. In fact, as Schaeffer has noted, Bar Kosiba's letters do not show a rebellion led by rabbis. Priests may have played a significant role, and there is no evidence of uniform participation by all Jews either. And what happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus? Eusebius of Caesarea states in Ecclesiastical History 4.6 that Bar Kosiba punished Christians who refused to renounce Jesus. This is a 4th century source with an evident Christian perspective. It may preserve the memory of a real conflict, but it does not prove that Akiva ordered that persecution. The separation between Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity was a long, regional, and deeply complex process, not a rupture decreed one Tuesday by Rabbi Akiva. Finally, we encounter an even greater accusation. Authors such as Daniel Gruber have portrayed the rebellion as a catastrophe that initiated a chain of suffering, leading ultimately to the Holocaust. The devastation of Judea was indisputably immense. But framing it as the linear cause of 18 centuries of anti-Semitism is a teleological construct, not a demonstrable historical conclusion. Akiva cannot be held retrospectively accountable for imperial decisions, religious persecutions, expulsions, pogroms, modern nationalisms, and genocide. We may ask whether he made a political miscalculation. We may ask whether he truly saw the Messiah in Bar Kosiba. We can even examine how later generations attempted to make sense of that failure. But there is a vast difference between historical responsibility and mythological culpability, and that difference is crucial. For a serious study of Akiva does not mean defending him against every accusation. It means something more difficult, holding him accountable only for what the evidence allows us to attribute to him. We now arrive at the most explosive accusation of this entire investigation. Rabbi Akiva misled Israel. The phrase is powerful. It provokes indignation, curiosity, and suspicion. But a historical accusation is not proven by its capacity to provoke. It is proven with evidence. In 1999, Daniel Gruber published Rabbi Akiva's Messiah, The Origins of Rabbinic Authority, reissued in 2013. From a Messianic Christian perspective, the book poses a provocative question. How could a foundational figure of Rabbinic Judaism recognize Bar Kosiba as the Messiah, while simultaneously rejecting the Christian Messianic claim regarding Jesus? The book serves as a polemical document. It compels us to examine uncomfortable sources, the human cost of the rebellion, the construction of rabbinic authority, and the dangerous relationship between messianism and political power. However, we must not confuse a polemical thesis with academic consensus. For Gruber begins with a theological premise. Bar Kosiba was the false Messiah, and Jesus was necessarily the true one. That conclusion may be legitimate within a religious confession, but critical historiography cannot introduce it as a premise before examining the evidence. So let us put Akiva on trial. First charge. Akiva invented Rabbinic Judaism. Verdict: an exaggeration. Akiva was extraordinarily influential as a teacher, interpreter, and systematizer, but he did not create everything from scratch. There were earlier traditions, Pharisaic antecedents, Yavne, other teachers, and other schools. Later came his disciples, Judah Hanasi, the Amoraim, and generations of redactors. Second charge: Akiva presented human inventions as the Torah of Moses. Here there is a much more interesting tension. Menachot 29b imagines Moses himself unable to comprehend a teaching of Akiva. And Azan Yadin Israel has studied the mechanisms by which received traditions can be presented, in a literary sense, as derivations from Scripture. That demonstrates interpretive development. Does it prove fraud? No. To speak of fraud, we need more than just innovation. We need to demonstrate that a person knew of the falsehood and deliberately intended to deceive. We do not possess such evidence regarding Akiva. Third charge: he proclaimed a false Messiah. Here we must be more careful. The Jerusalem Talmud tradition does indeed depict Akiva recognizing Bar Kosiba as the Messiah. Historically, this attribution is disputed, but let us assume it happened. In that case, Akiva may have been gravely mistaken. The subsequent defeat proved that Bar Kosiba's messianic project had failed. But Akiva, if he did indeed support him, was making a decision while history was still unfolding. We know the outcome. He did not. Fourth charge: he led Israel into a suicidal war. Not proven. The rebellion had political, territorial, religious, and imperial causes. If Akiva's support was historical, his authority could have provided religious legitimacy. That would be significant. But legitimizing a cause does not necessarily mean orchestrating it, commanding it, or controlling its military consequences. And the fifth charge: he persecuted Jews who believed in Jesus. This is not proven either. Eusebius attributes persecutions to Bar Kosiba. We possess no source demonstrating that Akiva ordered a campaign against the Jewish followers of Jesus. And here we arrive at the crucial distinction. Error, self-deception, propaganda, fraud, they do not mean the same thing. A person can sincerely believe something that is false. They can selectively interpret evidence because they desperately want something to be true. They can use political language to mobilize a cause. But fraud implies something far more serious: knowing of the falsehood and deliberately wanting others to believe it. Our sources do not allow us to enter Akiva's mind and demonstrate such intent. That is why Akiva, who deceived Israel, works extraordinarily well as a provocative question. As a historical verdict? No. And this distinction matters far beyond Akiva. For when we study religious figures we love or reject, we face two temptations: to turn them into saints, incapable of error, or to turn their mistakes into conspiracies. Serious history rejects both. Akiva could be a genius and still make mistakes. He could transform Judaism and yet have blind spots. He could interpret the Torah brilliantly and misjudge a political moment. Because recognizing a person's greatness does not require granting them infallibility, and acknowledging their errors does not entitle us to invent intentions for them. Perhaps that is the truly uncomfortable question Akiva leaves us with. Are we capable of studying our heroes without turning them into gods, and of studying our adversaries without turning them into demons? If we walk into a synagogue today, where there are no sacrifices, where we open a book, debate an interpretation, pray according to a calendar, and regard the study of Torah as a way of serving God, we are inhabiting a world that Rabbi Akiva played a decisive role in building. He did not build it alone, yet few figures better symbolize that transformation. The first revolution is authority based on learning. Akiva's traditional biography presents something socially extraordinary. A shepherd, supposedly a descendant of converts, could end up intellectually surpassing men of higher lineage. The message is revolutionary. Jewish authority no longer depends exclusively on priesthood, wealth, or birth. It also depends on mastery of the Torah. It is a new aristocracy, but an aristocracy of learning. The second transformation is what we might call portable holiness. The temple had been destroyed, so where could God be found? In prayer, in study, in the calendar, in the home, in the courtroom, in the community, in daily observance. This does not mean that Akiva theologically replaced the temple. Rabbinic literature continues to remember it, studying its sacrifices and awaiting its restoration. The transformation was different, learning to live fully as a Jew while the temple remained absent. The third legacy is regulated plurality. Akiva constantly debates with other sages, and this teaches us something fundamental. The oral Torah did not grow by eliminating all differing opinions. It grew by preserving controversies. The Mishnah records even minority positions, and the Gemara later turns disagreement into an intellectual method. Rabbinic authority does not consist solely of saying, "This is the answer." It also consists of establishing what evidence counts, how arguments are made, and through what procedures decisions are reached. Then, another extraordinary characteristic emerges: virtually infinite textuality. The Akiva of Menachot 29b embodies the conviction that no detail of the Torah is necessarily devoid of meaning. A single word, a repetition. Even in that extraordinary narrative, the crowns atop the letters. That sensibility runs through centuries of Rabbinic Judaism. Mishnah, Gemara, Geonim, Rishonim, Acharonim. Each generation receives earlier commentaries and adds new interpretations. Judaism thus becomes a civilization of cumulative reading. But Akiva left behind more than just an intellectual model. He also left a model of suffering. The account of his death while reciting the Shema made him the paradigm of Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of the name. For centuries, persecuted communities reinterpreted his figure through liturgy, poetry, and memory. His authority no longer stemmed solely from what he taught. It also derived from the image of the master willing to die while pronouncing Echad, one. And finally, we encounter the paradox of Bar Kosiba. If Akiva truly recognized him as a messianic figure, then one of Israel's greatest interpreters could have been spectacularly mistaken in interpreting his own times. Yet even that potential failure ultimately sparked reflection. Maimonides would use the very precedent of Akiva and Bar Kosiba to explain that the Messiah need not begin by performing spectacular miracles. His status must be verified by what he actually manages to achieve in history. It is almost a discipline of messianism. Hope remains, but history must validate the candidate. And here we can grasp the true dimension of Akiva. His influence does not lie in having invented the Judaism we know today. That would be a historical overstatement. It lies in his position at several of the pivotal points where Judaism learned to survive without being consumed by its own tragedy. From lineage to learning, from the destroyed sanctuary to everyday holiness, from the single answer to regulated controversy, from the closed text to endless generations of interpretation, from martyrdom to memory, and from messianic fervor to the need to validate hope through history. That is why Akiva remains relevant, because his great question continues to be our question. How can a tradition survive a catastrophe without simply becoming a museum of what it lost? The rabbinic response was extraordinary. When you can no longer carry the temple, you carry time, study, practice, and memory. And when a civilization learns to carry its holiness, it can lose its geographic center for centuries, without necessarily losing its spiritual center. After everything we have said about Rabbi Akiva, a fundamental question remains. If someone wanted to investigate this on their own, what should they read? After all, not every book about Akiva asks the same questions, employs the same methods, or carries the same academic weight. An excellent starting point is Barry W. Holtz's Rabbi Akiva, Sage of the Talmud, published by Yale in 2017. Holtz does not promise to reconstruct an impossible modern biography. Instead, he examines how the sources constructed Akiva's many facets: pragmatist and dreamer, jurist, mystic, lover, and martyr. For a beginner, it is likely the most balanced choice. However, if we wish to venture into critical territory, we should read Azan Yadin Israel's Scripture and Tradition, Rabbi Akiva and the Triumph of Midrash, published in 2015. Here, the scholarship becomes truly provocative. Yadin Israel analyzes the layers of the Sifra, proposes what he terms a hermeneutics of camouflage, and examines how the image of Akiva appears to transform over time. The relatively sober interpreter evolves into an almost oracular exegete, and a biography that begins as rather unremarkable eventually develops the narrative of the famous ignoramus who becomes a giant of Torah scholarship. This is crucial to our inquiry regarding how much of the Akiva we know belongs to the historical man and how much to the later construction of his authority. Another accessible book is Akiva, Life, Legend, Legacy by Raven Hammer, published in 2015. It offers a solid synthesis, though Tzvi Novik, in his review for the AJS Review, notes that Hammer does not always sufficiently distinguish between historical layers and narrative embellishments. That caveat effectively encapsulates the essence of our entire class. A tradition can be extraordinarily meaningful without serving as contemporary documentation. We should also be familiar with Louis Finkelstein's classic work, Akiba, Scholar, Saint, and Martyr, 1936. It is a hugely influential work, rich in rabbinic tradition, though it belongs to an era of scholarship that tended to harmonize sources with greater confidence than many modern studies do. In 1976, Judah Golden published Toward a Profile of a Tana, Akiba ben Yosef, an important philological and literary study that still merits attention. However, to understand the explosive issue of Bar Kosiba, we particularly need two researchers. Peter Schaefer questions overly uniform reconstructions of the rebellion, limits what can be asserted regarding alleged rabbinic leadership, and critically analyzes the association of Akiva with Bar Kosiba's messianism. And Matthew V. Novenson, in his 2009 article, Why Does Rabbi Akiva Acclaim Bar Kokhba as Messiah?, takes the issue even further. Novenson proposes understanding the scene as a late literary topos linking a religious authority with a ruler. If he is right, a significant part of the historical accusation against Akiva rests on a tradition whose current form cannot simply be projected back to the 2nd century. To understand the world surrounding Akiva, we need to expand our library even further. Shai J.D. Cohen in From the Maccabees to the Mishnah helps us understand the pluralism of ancient Judaism. Chaim Lapin in Rabbis as Romans places the rabbis within the social and political realities of Roman Palestine. Seth Schwartz in Imperialism and Jewish Society shows the extent to which imperial structures transformed Jewish society. And Elizabeth Shanks Alexander in Transmitting Mishnah demonstrates something essential. Oral transmission does not mean mechanical copying. It means selecting, ordering, adapting, and reconstructing. Finally, there is Daniel Gruber and Rabbi Akiva's Messiah. It must be read in a different category. It is a polemical work with a messianic Christian orientation, not a representation of the historiographical consensus. That does not mean we should ignore it. Quite the opposite. It can serve to identify challenging accusations against Akiva. But then we must weigh those accusations against the work of Holtz, Yadin Israel, Schaefer, Cohen, Lapin, and Novenson. And therein lies perhaps the most important methodological lesson of our entire inquiry. Do not look only for books that confirm what you already believe. Read the author who challenges your position as well. Then ask, what source is being used? From which century does it originate? Which part of the argument is evidence, and which part is interpretation? For to seriously research Rabbi Akiva does not mean deciding beforehand whether we wish to defend or condemn him. It means allowing the sources to speak before passing judgment. And that intellectual discipline, curiously enough, can also be a form of Torah study. After exploring the life, teachings, legends, controversies, and even the accusations surrounding Rabbi Akiva, we may discover that the most important question is not whether Akiva was a hero or a culprit. The question is, which Akiva are we studying? Religious tradition poses a legitimate and profound question. How did Rabbi Akiva help preserve, organize, and transmit the Torah following one of the greatest catastrophes in Jewish history? Historical criticism poses another. How did later generations construct the image of Akiva that has ultimately come down to us? And polemics introduce a third. Did Akiva use interpretation to attribute divine authority to human developments? Was he mistaken about Bar Kosiba? Did his school end up appropriating an authority it did not originally possess? All three questions can be asked. The problem arises when we use the answer to one as automatic evidence to resolve the others. A religious tradition may assert that Akiva faithfully transmitted the Torah. That constitutes a theological claim. It does not, in itself, prove every historical detail. A researcher may demonstrate that a narrative about Akiva was composed centuries later. That demonstrates temporal distance and literary evolution. It does not automatically prove that the narrative is false in every respect. And a polemicist may uncover contradictions, institutional agendas, or later reinterpretations. That may justify suspicion and questioning, but suspicion does not mean fraud. Evolution does not mean conspiracy, and tradition does not automatically mean history. This distinction is perhaps the most important methodological lesson of our entire course. Rabbi Akiva emerges from our sources on different levels. There is the historical Akiva, whom we attempt to reconstruct with caution. There is the Akiva of rabbinic memory, teacher, martyr, interpreter, and visionary. And there is the Akiva constructed later by philosophers, Kabbalists, historians, Christians, Jews, critics, and polemicists. They all speak of Akiva, but they are not always speaking of exactly the same figure, and perhaps therein lies the true greatness of studying him. For Akiva compels us to learn an intellectual discipline we desperately need in our times, distinguishing between what we know, what likely happened, what a community believed, and what we ourselves interpret. We can admire him without declaring him infallible. We can criticize him without casting him as a conspirator. We can study his religious traditions without abandoning historical inquiry. And we can listen to academic criticism without assuming that explaining how a tradition was constructed is tantamount to destroying its meaning. In the end, perhaps Rabbi Akiva continues to do for us what he did for generations of students, compelling us to read more closely, not to overlook details, to debate, to question. And above all, to understand that historical truth and spiritual meaning do not always answer the same question. Maturity begins when we stop forcing them to compete and learn to listen to what each truly has to say. That concludes today's lesson. Thank you for studying with us. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and visit our website, lawmishnah.com, for more information. This has been Abel Flores, founder of Law Mishnah TV, and to help you continue studying with us, I'm leaving a couple of videos here for you. Shalom.